Says alright everybody. Says welcome to the ultimate mod review, all things food. Says I might do more of these in the future. Says themed around other sets. Says let's get this started. Says for the first mod, Sushi Taco Delight, if I recall correctly. Says taco and sushi. Says you'll find it. Says it adds literally just the sushi taco. Says not a bad recipe, decent stats. Says and the name of the mod isn't a lie, so. Says yellow tear. Says I've divided up the mods into categories, and they'll have headers. Says time for the first category. Says first mod, Crotopia. Says that's how it's going to say it. Says Crotopia. Says okay. Says I love Crotopia. Says big variety in the crops added, and it adds a ton of new foods. Says recipes aren't bad. Says values are nice as well. Says for that. Says Crotopia gets a gold tier. Says the only thing that would make it higher is if it had more add-ons and compatibility. Says it works with Farmer's Delight, for the most part, but I wish it interacted more. Says, by works, I mean you need a compat mod to make it work. Says Crotopia Editions and Crotopia Chocolaterie. Says that is a good looking cake. Says Crotopia Editions nicely fills the holes left in Crotopia, and Chocolaterie adds some nice candies. Says tons of variety, easy to make it your own thing. Says Editions gets green. Says Chocolaterie gets gold. Says Editions could add more things, but it's nice the way it is too. Says I'm just gonna put my outfit here so I can clear my inventory the normal way. Says Kopana. Says I have yet to play with this mod, but from looks alone, I love it. Says comes with a guidebook. Says has lovely decor. Says the meals are custom, I believe. Says as in, when you make a meal, it's based on what ingredients you put in, not just a crafting recipe. Says very nice, very versatile. Says Kopana gets a gold tier. Says it also adds crops, which I forgot to mention. Says my opinion may change to diamond in the future. Says convivium. Says this one is an add-on for Copana. Says gorgeous. Says this add-on is based around decor and functional blocks for Copana. Says as well as beverages. Says convivium gets a green. Says purely for the fact that it doesn't add much food, and this ranking is more so about the food. Says I also can't see the recipes, but I assume it would be somewhat easy to figure out. Says if I do a more in-depth review, I'll figure it out. Says lemon. Says this is technically called a Farmer's Delight mod. Says but the only delightful thing is that you slice the lemon. Says this mod is getting an orange. Says it adds 5 things, and only 2 are food. The novelty of a lemon gun doesn't do enough for me. Says I almost forgot my honorable mentions. Says abnormal's delight, adds compat between Farmer's Delight and mods by the Abnormals team. Wonderful mod, I just didn't feel like tracking down all the abnormal mods it adds compat to. Says various Cobb Lemon delights, very fun, but Cobb Lemon is too intensive for this already massive pack. Says Cobb Lemon. Says TFC X Farmer's Delight, phenomenal pairing, TFC is just too much for the pack, as it's an overhaul. Says cooking for blockheads, a must-have for kitchen decor and food-heavy packs, not included as it's furniture and not food. Says Drans Mods, livestock overhaul, well, overhauls livestock, crop overhaul and fortuitous feasts add a ton of crops and foods, and medieval embroidery adds food as well. Says top tier for medieval themed packs, just too intense for this one. Says Thirst was taken, my favorite Thirst mod. Easy to configure when you have modded foods and drinks. Says let's do series, I have some of the mods, but all of their mods add food. I think. I just chose the ones that center food. Says all of the butchering and slaughter mods, some of my favorite mods, they just don't play well together and I didn't want to pick favorites. Says back to the mods I actually have installed. Says Ultimate Baking. Says visually. I love it. Conceptually. Outstanding. Says recipes, not the worst. Says values. Absurd. Says an unglazed donut should not have 72 saturation. Says the two enchanted ones I can somewhat excuse, but that's still over 100 saturation. Says due to the absurd saturation levels, ultimate baking is orange tear. Says if it had normal saturation values, it would be green for sure. Says Sweet Tales. Says this mod adds a ton of jams. Says there's an entire creative tab for it. Says though it is more focused on other things, like this little guy. Says I love him. Says green tear. No regerts. Says Nutella. Says adds 2 ors. Says one of which is platinum, for some reason. Says wood isn't bad. Says armor set is kinda cute. Says chocolate goop should spread slower, and would be nicer with a custom texture rather than just brown water. Says oh wow. Says chocolate cow is broken. Says and only drops normal cow stuff. Says Nutella blocks are cute. Says but it all falls apart at the values. Says 74 saturation for sugar, milk, and cocoa beans. Says way too much. Says bakeries could excuse it, as the recipes had more going on. Says but this is absurd. Says red tear. Says if you really want Nutella, go ahead and add it, but the saturation is just insane. Says Sushi Go Crafting. Says similarly to Kopana, I believe this mod has custom food. Says, as in, it matters what you put in. Says add some tools, mobs, and blocks. Says Sushi Go Crafting gets a green tear. Says it would be higher if it had compatibilities with other mods, using fish fillets and rice from Pam, Crotopia, or Farmer's Delight. Says Hot Dog Delight. Says doesn't actually add that many hot dogs. Says half of them are raw or bunless. Says has compatibility with Farmer's Delight, but doesn't actually use any of the equipment. Says orange tear. Says for something being all about hot dogs, it doesn't add a lot of hot dogs. Says hibernal herbs. Says adds a ton of herbs and herb blends. Says cute Woodset. Says adds lanterns as well. Says herbs function as edible potions. Says orange tear. Says I wish the herbs could be applied to food, somehow, unless they can, and I'm just missing that. Says if they could / can, green tear. Says I misspoke, they're yellow tear. Says misspoke. Says golden foods. Says it is what it says on the label. Says every vanilla food has a golden and enchanted variant. Says saturation makes sense, compared to golden apples. Says they all provide golden apple effects. Says good, doesn't add golden rotten flesh. Says gold tear. Says could I really put it anywhere else? Haha. Says I would love an add-on mod that lets you cook with these foods, but I enjoy it the way it is as well. Says Feasts of the Fallout. Says this is definitely going in my next sci-fi mod pack. Says huge. Says close your eyes. Says adds a ton of mobs, food, and equipment. Says oh my god. Says oh god hang on. Says I'm back. Says and I think everything is where it was. Says anywho. Says Feasts of the Fallout, Gold Tier. Says some of the foods have slightly high saturations. Says but they require like, Meyer-Lurk meat. Says so that can be excused. Says feastful. Says this one adds some absolutely adorable food. Says I recommend it for a cute mod pack. Says it adds some alcohol as well. Says and some crops. Says gold tier. Says wish it worked with other mods flour and stuff. Says cheesy and fizzy. Says adds 7 cheeses and 7 sodas, I think. Says something like that. Says works with other mods ingredients. Says recipes aren't bad. Says cheese requires a basin, though. Says green tier. Says an in-game guide to cheese would be nice. Says Jesus. Says adds plenty of cheeses. Says and some cheesy foods. Says cheese tutorials are on the mod page, but I love in-game guides. Says green tier. Says some saturation levels are out there. Says would be gold if the saturation was a bit more balanced. Says all the nuggets. Says pretty self-explanatory. Says I feel like the nugget box is a bit up, considering you could use a low saturation meat like rabbit. Says very cute though. Says yellow tier. Says due to the saturation of the nugget box. Says loafed. Says very simple. Says wish it worked with other mods, using breads from other mods. Says or eggs and milks. Says but if you crave toast it's nice. Says orange tier. Says none of these tiers are bad, by the way. Says it's just based on my personal, picky preferences. Says Candy Workshop. Says adds a ton of candies. Says including some that have mod compatibility, I believe. Says yep, I'm right. Says candies mostly function as edible potions. Says very cute, recommended for cute packs. Says green tier. Says I'm a sucker for compatibility. Says Neapolitan. Says adds 4 new crops. Says also adds ice cream, milkshakes, and various foods with these crops. Says again recommended for cute packs. Says spawns banana trees in jungles that chimps gather around. Says he want the banana. Says monkey not block. Says diamond tier. Says monkey want banana. Says also has compat with other mods. Says please get down from there. Says I love this painting. Says Pam hashtag. Says, love. Says it's Pam. Says diamond tier. Says used to have foods that had no uses, but in my recent checks, those issues are gone. Says also has compat with other mods now, that used to be a problem too. Says adds so much food, and it's modular. Says though I always recommend the full set. Says the variety is wonderful. Says beer mod. Says recipes not visible in game. Says saturation's out of this world. Says unless it takes like 30 days to ferment, this is ridiculous. Says 30 seconds of nausea isn't that bad, especially for 100 saturation. Says red tear. Says there's so many better alternatives. Says kawaii dishes. Says adds a ton of food, some decor, and also outfits. Says very cute. Says recipes visible in game, recipes not bad. Says food values are also reasonable. Says and it's so cute. Says highly recommend for cute packs. Says green tear. Says just wish it had compats. Says soot sandwich craft. Says one of my new fave mods. Says adds tons of breads, cheeses, sandwiches, and sides. Says adds sauces, and plenty of crops. Says has some compatibility. Says actually seems to have full compatibility. Says diamond tear. Says I just remembered, actually. Says bread and cheese recipes are on the mod page, not in game. Says once the recipes are in game, diamond tier. For now, gold. Says my second new favorite mod, bakeries. Says animated equipment. Says cute food. Says reasonable recipes and good values. Says end. Says best of all. Says an in-game guide. Says diamond tier. Says sugar delight. Says adds 3 berries, as well as various candies and teas. Says hello mod author. Says he can have some Easter cake. Says recipes reasonable, values good, gold tier. Says I just wish there were a few more things, I don't have everything in my inventory, I'm just greedy. Says alright. Says that's all of the standalones. Says winery. Says adds a ton of wines. Says recipes visible in game. Says I like the notes being listed, and the values are good. Says gold tier, could have compats. Says garnished. Says adds a ton of nuts. Says woods are pretty nice. Says also adds a ton of interesting foods. Says Says diamond tear. Says saturation values are kinda low for the steps required for some of these, but I would rather have low sat than high sat. Says Bitterballen. Says adds a ton of fried foods. Says ketchup flows slowly and isn't retextured water. Says sat values and recipes look good. Says diamond tear. Says factory. Says it adds nice food, but most of them are just variants with different chocolates. Says recipes are pretty complex for their sat values. Says yellow tear. Says for once, I want higher sat values. Says confectionery. Says once again, the bulk of the mod is variants. Says but there's enough base items for it to not feel bad. Says some nice decor blocks. Says and little guys. Says Green Tear. Says I don't know why I'm not putting it higher. Says Cafe. Says has compat, and some recipes require other mods for their ingredients. Says recipes are nice, icons are cute. Says sat values are good. Says Green Tear. Says too many recipes require other mods. Says alright, create done. Says Vinery. Says cute decor. Says pretty complex recipes, and I'm not sure if the wines give sat or not. Says Yellow Tear. Says Herbal Brews. Says this one adds teas and stuff. Says yeah he. Says simple recipes, balanced set values. Says Green Tier, would be gold, but no let's do mods have compats. Says Farm and Charm. Says okay this one technically has compats. Says but not much. Says has pet bowls. Says Green Tier. Says Candlelight. Says I love this one. Says absolutely adorable. Says adds fancy dinners, rings, and fancy tableware. Says Diamond Tier. Says recipes are balanced, has compats, and has good SAT values. Says I guess they're adding compats now. Says Baker. Says Bakery asterisk. Says has tons of cute foods. Says has cute decor and cute recipes. Says Diamond Tier. Says this is the Big Mama. Says Speed Round. Says Farmer's Delight. Says Diamond Tear. Says I need no explaining. Says such a wonderful foundation. Says Roll Delight. Says adds ton of sushi rolls. Says Yellow Tear. Some SAT values should be tweaked. Says Haunted Harvest. Says cute, but small. Says mainly just adds corn. Says Yellow Tear, could add more corn-based foods and more haunted items. Says Rib Delight. Says only adds a few things, and some SAT values are off the wall. Says Orange Tear. Says Brain Delight. Says I can wear a cone on my head. Says enough said. Green Tear. Says Farmer's Larfer. Says Larder asterisk. Says adds a ton of vanilla-based foods. Says some textures don't fit the rest. Says but recipes and SAT values aren't bad. Says Yellow Tear. Says Polish Delight. Says only adds a few shums. Says educational with its descriptions. Says could use more items, more desserts. Green Tear. Says Aqua Delight. Says lets you eat drowned. Says cooked pufferfish should give poison. Says yellow tear. Says whoa those sats. Says orange actual. Says arbitrary delight. Says place textures are missing. Says some sats are off. Says yellow tear. Says trails and tails delight. Says I can do that. Says not a super ton of food, but very nice food. Says yellow tear. Says corn delight. Says adds a ton of corn food. Says I would like more types of chips and popcorn. Green tear. Says crabber plus crabber expanded. Says good recipes on both, and good saturations on both. Says both green tear. Says sandwich delight. Says an underwhelming amount of sandwiches. Says green tear. Says creepy delight. Says some saturations are crazy, unless these ingredients are very rare. Says yellow tear. Says crops and trees delight. Says adds a ton of crops and trees. Says saturation values are absolutely newts. Says some recipes unavailable. Says orange tear. Says okay y'all. Says that's it for now. Says I hope you enjoyed part 1 of this tier list / review. Says I plan to make a second one that should be out tomorrow. Says like, comment, subscribe. Says insert epic outro here.